With a history getting close to 30 years, the Pokemon TCG has had a long and rich history. Some of that history is filled with fun memories, competition and joy. And some of that history is filled with some of the most hated cards I've ever seen. Cards that just the mere mention of their names will get players' heart rates racing and blood pumping in anger. And that is what we are looking at here today. From all the way back from base set right up until the present day. The most hated cards in Pokemon history. Let's go. Now I must preface everything I'm about to say by saying I exclusively played this card from the day it got printed until the day it rotated out. So truth be told, I'm a big fan. However, people actually couldn't stand this card. So many people were clamoring for it to be banned. Something that Pokemon don't really do too often. And on face value, it seems very hard to imagine why a little one prize Pokemon could be ban worthy. So let's have a look into why. I mean, sure, on face value, it's a basic Pokemon with a big amount of HP, 130, and Shadow Impactors 132, which at the time was, you know, decent, okay at best. Big things in the format had 240 to 280 HP, tag team Pokemon. So you were either just creeping into 2-hit range with Shadow Impact, or you were just missing 2 shots. Against one prize stuff, however, you were pretty much laughing. You could pretty much one-hit them all. So how could a card that wasn't even 2-shot in most of the format be so hated then? Well, even though Shadow Impact was a tiny bit shy of 2-hitting the massive tag team Pokemon, it had a massive myriad of different ways to make that damage up. Spell Tag existed, which was a tool card that said when the psychic Pokemon this card is attached to is knocked out, you can place 4 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way you like. This was perfect since the format had very limited gust options at the time, with most decks just playing custom catchers, which your opponent could only use twice in the whole game, and if one got discarded or prized, well, then it was a lot harder for them. This meant your opponent was normally forced to hit into the Spell Tag, and this pushed Giratina into the 2-hit KO range. This, however, wasn't the main way Giratina could get extra damage into play. The other way was the most hated part of this Giratina card, its ability, Distortion Door. This, in my opinion, has the potential of being one of the best abilities ever printed. This allowed you to get Giratina out of the discard pile and put it on your bench. And if you did, you could put 1 damage counter on 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. This is crazy. This would have been good even if it didn't spread damage, but since you do, you're now a 2-hit KOing Beat Stick, which you can just constantly recycle every time it gets KO'd, meaning you can just afford to run 2 of these and you never have to worry about having to shuffle it back in to reuse it. But the extra damage from Distortion Door meant you could be really clinical with hitting the bench too, since the 10s from Distortion Door in combination with Spell Tag really started to add up quick. This even opened the door later on for some shenanigans with Cosmic Eclipse Bucephalon, which would spread 12 damage counters when your opponent had 3 prize cards left. Yeah, back in the day, spreading 12 damage counters was actually kind of hard, you know. And since you would normally present a 1 prize board, this was very easy to manipulate and force your opponent into. But being able to recycle Giratina is one thing sure. But if you aren't able to accelerate energy to it, it's kind of useless, right? Well, luckily for Giratina, Malamar existed too. This provided the perfect energy acceleration, since Malamar would attach 1 psychic from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. This meant if you had 3 Malamar out, you could easily recycle the Giratina and attack with it, irrespective of what's in your hand. Jirachi from Team Up provided the perfect free retreat pivot too, since with its Stellar Wish ability, you could look at the top 4 cards of your deck and take a trainer card and put it in your hand. Then Jirachi would go asleep. This would normally be disastrous, but since a skateboard existed, you could retreat when you were asleep, meaning your Giratina would get KO'd, you would promote Jirachi, grab a trainer, use Distortion Door, use Circuit Recharge 3 times, and get back to work again. This resulted in an extremely strong deck. Sure, but why did people want it banned? Well, the combination of 130 damage from Shadow Impact, Distortion Door, and Spell Tags really left very little room in the format for other 1 prize decks to exist. Since Giratina's output and HP was so large, there was pretty much 0 reason to play any other 1 prize deck, since their stats would almost always be lower than Giratina. Only really Granbull and White Kyurem did any meta damage while Giratina existed, and they could all take massive 1-hit KOs. Every other 1 prize deck got pushed out of the format, to never be seen again. Let me take you back to US Nationals 2015. Enrique Avila found himself in the finals against Jason Klaczynski. Enrique's deck was something we had never seen before. First up, he only played 2 different kinds of Pokemon, one of which was Suicune, which had the safeguard ability, making itself immune to damage from EX Pokemon, which was, well and good. But the star of the show was the 4 copies of Warlord EX. This massive 250 HP basic Pokemon was obscene at the time. This meant pretty much nothing could one-shot it. This meant Warlord would stick around for massive amounts of time, and this is exactly what Enrique wanted. He aimed to try and deck his opponent out so he could win. Well, how would he do this then? Well, absorb as much damage as possible and heal it all away. 4 Hard Charm would give Warlord a minus 20 damage reduction, which was huge. Rough Seas would also let you heal 30 from your water types, which gave Warlord even more survivability. And after that, the healing starts to get a little bit silly. So let's do a speed round as we talk about them. 4 copies of AZ, which lets you pick up a Pokemon and discard all cards attached to it, removing all damage. 4 Cassius, which picks up a Pokemon and shuffles it away, removing all damage. 4 Max Potion, which just straight up heals all damage. 4 VS Seeker, which lets you reuse any of those supporters over and over and over again. So we had a ton of ways to heal damage in this deck. However, we also had a ton of ways to stop your opponent attacking too. We already mentioned Suicune, but how about 14 Flare Gun to remove energy from your opponent's active, 3 times Enhanced Hammer just to remove special energy, and 2 times Shoe, which would punish your opponents for holding massive hand sizes, since it forced both players to either discard or draw till they had 5 cards in their hand. And it was this event right here where the Wallstall archetype was born, and the player base absolutely despised it ever since. The nature of your opponent just doing everything and anything to stop you from playing the game unfortunately winds people up the wrong way. Other superstars of the Wallstall archetype include Acerola, which would let you pick up a damaged Pokemon and all card attached to it and put it back in your hand. Regigigas later on was a 1 prize Pokemon with 180 HP. Wishiwashi GX, a big basic but with 210. Hooper had the safeguard ability like Suicune. Lily's Pokédoll gave up no prizes, and you would often try and reuse them as much as possible with Florges. Steelix was a pretty big geezer and had access to Metal Frying Pan. Vileplume was just straight up immune to damage from basic Pokemon. And Luke Metal, which would discard all energies from your opponent's active and reduce damage by 30 for the rest of the game with its GX attack. And while I actually appreciate these archetypes and actually think it's a sign of a healthy meta in my opinion when they exist, this doesn't stop most of the player base from absolutely downright hating whenever these decks exist in any capacity. Massive shout out to Resource Management Oran Guru 2, who was the face of a very similar strategy, but it was a bit more offensive in its game plan. You would aim to rip all the cards from your opponent's hand by playing Reset Stamp when they have taken 2 prize cards. This would give them a hand of 4. Then you would play Lieutenant Surge's strategy, which would let you play an extra 2 supporter cards this turn. Then you play Jesse James to force them to discard 2 cards from their hand, and then you play Mars to discard another one. This combined with Chip Chip Ice Axe would let you control whatever your opponent draws, so you can really limit what they do. How would Oranguru help this strategy? Well, it relied on your opponent being able to do absolutely nothing. So Resource Management, which would let you shuffle in 3 cards from your discard pile back in your deck, would let you reuse cards like Crushing Hammer to remove your opponent's energy. This variant of control relied on Pidgeot's airmail ability, so you could filter cards into your hand throughout the course of the game. Later on in the format, an even faster aggressive mill deck was born, which could be argued was definitely tier 1 at the time. This version would aim to get your deck down to 0 ASAP by using Make Do with Cincino and Zacian's Intrepid Sword ability. Then you would use Power Pad to shuffle in Belelba and Bryson Man so you could play them over and over again, discarding 3 cards from your opponent's deck each time. Eventually, when your opponent has 11 cards left in their deck, you could go Lieutenant Surge for double Belelba Bryson Man, plus Burning Magma GX from Macargo to mill those last 11 cards in one brutal turn. And Resource Management really helped this archetype shine and be a deadly force in the metagame. So shoutouts to him, I guess. Oh boy, where to begin with this absolute unit? Back when Furious Fist was revealed, I don't think the player base was ready for the absolute most dominant item lock we have ever seen. Quaking Punch for a DCE would do 30 damage and item lock your opponent. While this damage doesn't seem like a lot, bear in mind the magic number of HP back then was 180. So 30 was actually a pretty good chunk. Muscle Band existed too, which would give Quaking Punch a damage dealing potential of 50. But here's where it got a little bit silly. Burbank City Gym would boost poison damage to 30 in between turns. So when Quaking Punch was combined with Hypnotoxic Laser, this would now give you 80 damage, which was getting dangerously close to two-shotting the format. And it'd also give you a 25% chance of leaving your opponents active asleep too. All while locking off items which we all know can be absolutely debilitating. But it got even madder, since when Phantom Forces came out, this Crobat line was released, and this gave you an extra 50 damage when you evolve through the whole line. This would make Seismitoad now the best disruption attacker of all time, bar none. Being able to one-shot stuff while item locking is downright unacceptable. But it didn't stop there, since you could pair Seismitoad with a myriad of different attackers to be even more disruptive. For example, Giratina EX to become immune to Mega Pokemon and prevent special energies and stages from being played with Chaos Will. Garbodor just to ability lock as well. Crawdont to remove energy. And there's even a straight Toad variant where you play Assault Vest or Fighting Fury Belt to buff HP, and you would spam red card to reduce your opponent's hand size down to 4 before item locking them. And bear in mind, Seismitoad was a basic Pokemon too, that attacked for 1 energy attachment. So cards like Super Scoop Up or Scoop Up Cyclone would fully heal Seismitoad and allow you to attack in the same turn like nothing was wrong. And this is exactly why we will never ever see a basic Pokemon that can item lock for 1 energy attachment ever again. We have come close with cards like Vikavolt and Banette, but we will never ever see item lock as strong as Seismitoad EX ever again. I promise you. So this is the card that everyone has been clambering on about in the comments ever since I started this series. And for good reason, to be honest. Arceus Dialga Palkia, or ADP as I will be referring to it from now on, was an absolute menace, tearing up the format and winning games in 3 turns. Very ridiculously easily too. How is this then? Well, ADP had the GX attack Ultra Creation, which for water and a metal energy would make your Pokemon do an extra 30 damage for the rest of the game, which is low-key pretty bonkers enough, right? But you could also take an extra prize card whenever you knock something out for the rest of the game. This, as you can imagine, was rather good. Now, we have seen extra prize effects be really strong in the past, with cards like Deoxys Rayquaza Legend, Stoutland V, and probably Iron Hands 2 as it's ready to break the format, by the way. But ADP, I think, was on the next level, operating on magnitudes levels higher than them. Ultra Creation was so strong that even though you gave up all offensive pressure on turns 1 and 2, just to do Ultra Creation, it really didn't matter since you caught up so fast on turns 3 and turns after. Out of the gates, ADP decks were pretty clunky. There really wasn't a great partner for ADP, so players were forced to adopt a slightly more defensive option in Keldeo GX. This was a rare 2 prize card that had immunity to other 2 prize, and 3 prize cards as well with its ability Pure Heart. This could make life very hard for other tag team decks like Pikarom or Celisaur for example, since it would completely wall them out. Keldeo being a GX Pokemon though meant you could turn its ability off with Power Plant, which is something a lot of decks would try to do. However, ADP players would often play a Chaotic Swell, which would bounce any other staging replacement instantly, letting Keldeo go straight back to work. And even the previously mentioned Giratina, being one of the best 1 prize options to ever exist, couldn't go toe to toe with Keldeo, since the plus 30 buff meant that Keldeo would now one-shot Giratina easily and take 2 prize cards while doing so. This ADP version was good, don't get it twisted. What happened next for ADP decks though took it to a whole new stratosphere. Sword and Shield introduced Zacian V, and this took ADP's power level to silly new heights. Zacian V, quite honestly, might be the best attacking card ever printed. A basic Pokemon that did 230 damage was silly, and its ability meant you would get an extra 3 cards on turn 1 no matter what. Crazy stuff. This meant after the Ultra Creation buff, Zacian would swing for 260 damage. Perfect for clearing everything out of the way that wasn't a tag team or a VMAX Pokemon. But wait, Galarian Zigzagoon came out in Sword and Shield too, and this let you put 1 damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon when you bench it. This now meant that 270 HP tag teams were now in one-shot range, like Reshizard for example, leaving only 280 HP Pokemon safe. But wait, it gets even better, since you could play it with Vitality Band 2. This would now give Zacian an extra 10 damage, meaning you could swing for a table-shattering 280 damage, making any non-VMAX Pokemon, well, Zacian food. Bear in mind, those big tag team KOs would now be worth 4 prize cards too. So all you literally had to do was KO anything else and the game was wrapped up. But those wasn't the only additions from Sword and Shield, however. One weakness of ADP decks is that they were solely reliant on ADP's other attack, Ultimate Ray, to set up your attackers. Since Ultimate Ray would do 150, well, normally 180 damage, and accelerate 3 basic energies from your Pokemon in any way you like. If you were playing against a Turbo deck, however, the likelihood of your ADP surviving to where you can use a successful Ultimate Ray was pretty low, since cards like Reshizar's Double Blaze GX would annihilate you. Sword and Shield changed this, since Metal Saucer now existed, a card that would attach a metal energy from your discard pile to one of your bench metal Pokemon. This meant if your ADP went down, you could still turbo through your deck to get a Brave Blade off, something that was fairly easy to do, all things considered. Metal Saucer also offered the option for a turn 1 Alter Creation, since you could attach water energy to ADP, Metal Saucer to Zacian, then play Energy Switch, moving that metal to ADP, which would now give you unparalleled pressure. Some players even opted to go second solely for this strategy. This even led to the variant Clay DP for people who wanted to exclusively go for that turn 1 play. But believe it or not, ADP got even better in the next set, Rebel Clash, since that introduced reliable Gust into the format via Boss's Orders. This meant if you managed to get to Ultimate Ray, you could easily boss up an opponent's Crobat V or Dedenne for 3 prize cards, all while setting up your Zacian at the same time, basically checkmating your opponent. This even gave you a win con versus traditionally bad matchups like Eternatus VMAX, since Eternatus VMAX had a monstrous 340 HP. You had no way of one-shotting that. So what ADP players would do is it should go around the Eternatus by bossing 2 Crobats to win the game, leading to the phrase boss game to be immortalized by the community, which perfectly encapsulated how it felt to be playing against ADP sometimes, because you had literally nothing you could do to stop it, since the power was always in their hands. If they could KO something, they were probably going to win. And they would win frighteningly fast. A lot of people's main gripes with ADP is that it seemed to push all 1 prize decks out of the format, since all ADP players had to do is KO 3 of them to win the game instead of a normal 6. A feat that was very easy to do, since ADP players against 1 prize decks would often be able to use Ultimate Ray, which would make the game much easier. And while this is true, I think it'd be criminal not to mention I think Luke Metalization was just as bad for 1 prize decks to deal with, since their damage reduction and healing was just as problematic as ADP in my opinion. The only 1 prize deck that could compete at the time was Bucephalon, and that's an anomaly since it could do 300 damage turn 1. So yeah, it's not hard to see why that could compete. Nothing else could though, and that is why ADP will go down as one of the most hated cards in Pokemon history. This card though, this card right here, might go down in history as the most problematic card ever. So problematic in fact, it forced the Pokemon company to do something they have never done before, but more on that later. Let's take a look at what this little Sableye could do. First, its ability Overeager meant that if you led Sableye and your opponent didn't, you could opt to go first, no questions asked, immediately giving you a huge advantage. If your opponent had led a low HP Pokemon like Beltoy for example, you could just immediately KO it, since it would do a base 40 damage if your opponent's active had less HP than Sableye, so with any little damage buff like Crobat G or Expert Belt or Special Darkness Energy, you could win the game right there before your opponent had a chance to do anything. And bear in mind, back in 2008, most tournaments were exclusively best of 1 Swiss. So yeah, this Sableye could just win you around pretty easily, huh? However, this wasn't the main use for Sableye back then. It was mostly used as a setup or disruptive option. Since you could attack going first, you could use Impersonate, for free by the way, to discard a supporter and use the effect of it as this attack. So turn 1, you could use Impersonate to copy Bebe Search or Collector later on, just to set up, happy day. This was pretty nice. However, as the game went on, you could now use Sableye in a much more mean way, since you could play Judge for your supporter for the turn, reducing your opponent's hand size to 4, then use Impersonate to copy Cyrus's Initiative, which would let you flip 2 coins for each head. You get to look at your opponent's hand and put 1 card you find there to the bottom of their deck. This is absolutely insane when you break it down. So 50% of the time you'd reset your opponent's hand to 4 and then rip the best card out of those 4, and 25% of the time you would leave them with a 2-card hand. Brutal. This combination of mid to late game luck, plus the sometimes early game donk potential, made Sableye a terror of the format, and it was only going to get worse as we fast forward to when Black and White was getting ready to release, and Pokemon were looking to change the rule set to allow the player going first to play a supporter card and item cards now too. This would make Sableye an absolute terror. You see, players quickly realised that they now had all the cards to win a game going first, even if their opponent led 3 Pokemon. How is this then? What on earth is this madness? Well, with cards like Pokeblower, Crobat G, and Poketurn to reuse Crobat G, and cards like Super Scoop Up, we could pile a ton of damage into one of our opponent's Pokemon, enough to KO them mid-turn. Because bear in mind, basics with 80 HP then were very rare. Normally, it was a lot lower. So let's just say one bench Pokemon is down now, but we still have one bench Pokemon to go, and the active. What do we do about that? Well, Seeker would force your opponent to pick up the other bench Pokemon, leaving you with just the active to go. And at that point, all you would do is spam the rest of your damage dealing cards, attach Expert Belt to give Sableye the extra 10 damage, while also giving Sableye an extra 20 health, making the extra damage from Overconfident easier to get. Special Darkness Energy also gave you a little bit of extra damage, and with cards like Uxie, which lets you draw till you have 7 cards in your hand, this was actually a very easy combo to pull off. You even had cards like Regice, which would let you push a high HP Pokemon out the active to make the turn 1 win easier. Cards like Unknown Dark would find your energy, Unknown R would let you draw cards, and Alpha Lithograph would let you liberate important cards from your prizes. This Sable Donk deck was no joke, with J-Wit saying on record that if your opponent led 3 80 HP Pokemon but you were going first, you had an 80% chance to win the game on your turn 1 before they have had a chance to do anything. And bear in mind, how common is it really for you to have 3 basic Pokemon in your starting hand? That's actually pretty low. So if your opponent had like 2 Pokemon, let's say, your success rate would be skyrocketing to near 100. Getting ridiculous. The format was shaping up to be pretty much everyone playing Sable Donk, and then games would be decided on Sableye flip to see who would actually go first. Because if you didn't go first, you were losing right there and then. This was so bad that TPCI had to step in and do something they had never done before, a mid-season rotation. And this yeeted Sableye and all his shenanigans out the format. Absolutely spectacular show for such a little guy, eh? When Trevenant first came out, it looked as if it was going to be a strong card, but it didn't quite have the offensive pressure to compete with anything. While its Forest Curse ability was absolutely insane, preventing your opponent from playing any item cards while Trevenant was in the active, its Tree Slam attack was just too costly and didn't really do enough damage for it to just sit there, stay in the active and attack. However, as more and more sets came out, Trev slowly started to develop and get more sneaky under the radar buffs. Phantom Forces introduced Dimension Valley, which reduced each Psychic's Pokemon's attack cost by 1 colourless energy. This made Tree Slam slightly more usable. Roaring Skies introduced Wally, and this would let you bypass normal evolution rules by letting you search your deck for a card that evolved from one of your Pokemon in play and evolve it, no questions asked. This meant you could spring a Trevenant on your first turn going first, or second even, making that item lock terrifying. And now with Wally in format, people could start to take Trevenant seriously, and it started to see more event success, including 5 national top 8s and a 5th place finish at 2015 Worlds. Although all these variants use Gengar EX to attack, since Dark Corridor would do 60 damage, poison your opponent's active and then switch to the bench. This provided a much more solid damage output, especially when compared to Tree Slam. This was all set to change however when Breakpoint released, since there was now a new shiny toy for Trevenant players to play with, and it was a doozy. Trevenant Break would go on top of Trevenant, giving it more HP, a new golden look, and a new attack, all while retaining its killer Forest Curse ability. This attack took Trev from a strafe deck all the way to a standalone archetype, since Silent Fear would put 3 damage counters on all your opponent's Pokemon. This would add up at a very fast rate. And remember, Dimension Valley still existed, so we could use this attack for 1 energy. This deck was absolutely terrifying, since you would pretty much get item locked every time before you even had a chance to play a card. And that alone could lose you the game. But even if you could get into the game somewhat, you now had to deal with 160 HP one prize Pokemon that were all item locking you and spreading damage at a silly rate. Trev players would even opt to play red card to consistently reset your hand down to 4, they'd also play 4 Crushing Hammer, stop you attacking, and even sometimes had head ringers to make your Pokemon's attack cost more. Brutal. This made for a deadly deck that the community hated playing against, and it's not hard to see why. While there were a ton of cards in the early days of the Pokemon TCG, I decided to single out a few that, when clumped all together, made for one of the worst formats to have ever existed. So this is a time in between Gym Heroes and Neo Genesis, and this was not a fun time at all. If you started the game with one basic Pokemon and you were going second, something that's, pretty common all things considered, your opponent just had to use Erica's Jigglypuff, one copy of Double Colorless Energy, and one copy of Plus Power to just straight up win the game right there and then, no questions asked. However, if you were going second and you had 2 basic Pokemon start the game, you would at least get 1 turn, which is nice. But you would start that game with a 0 card hand. How? Well, you see, if your opponent was going first, they would be tearing through their deck with Professor Oak and Bill. Remember, there was no supporters at the time, so you could play as many trainers as you like in the turn, to piece together one of the most dirtiest combos I've ever seen. First, you would play Imposter's Professor Oak, which would reset your opponent's hand down to 4. Then you would play Rocket Sneak Attack, which would let you look at your opponent's hand and shuffle away 1 trainer, leaving them now with a 3 card hand, and most likely a bad hand at that. However, players would not stop there, as they would now start to play as many copies of Rocket's Trap, which would let you flip a coin. If heads, you would shuffle 3 cards from your opponent's hand back into the deck at random. And remember, even if you flip tails, you could just spam item finders to keep trying again. And voila, you have now left your opponent with 1 Pokemon in play, thanks to Erica's bloodthirsty Jigglypuff, and you've sent them to Top Deck City, since they now have no cards in their hand too. This made for a time where playing the game left you in a constant fear of having a 0 card hand and living on top decks. And sometimes those top decks wouldn't even matter, since if your opponent was extra dastardly, they would play Chaos Gym too, which would force a player to flip a coin whenever they decide to play a trainer. If it was heads, you could play it, happy days. If it was tails though, that trainer card would fail and still get discarded. But your opponent could actually use it if they wanted to, just to add insult to injury. So let's break this all down. If you was going second, you had to lead 2 basic Pokemon to even have a chance at the game. If you did, one of those would get KO'd no matter what. You would have a 0 card hand to start the game, and 50% of the time, even if you top deck Professor Oak, you wouldn't even be able to play it. Absolutely unbelievable, eh? While this card's reign of terror was short-lived, it was definitely a card that struck fear into the hearts of the player base. While this card looks pretty chill, I promise you it was everything but that. Exeggutor had the blockade attack, which would do 10 damage and prevent your opponent from playing any supporter cards next turn. While this sounds very mediocre, trust me, it got out of hand real fast. So that 10 damage spiraled out of control when you factored in Muscle Band to boost it by 20 and then Laser Bank combo to boost it to 60. Now we're getting to the point where Blockade would start to put your opponent on a strict timer, since you really couldn't afford to sit there and absorb 60 damage turn after turn, especially when you consider 25% of the time your active will be asleep from that hypnotoxic laser. And it really doesn't stop there, since Exeggutor players would force a whole new host of energy disruption, like Crushing Hammer, Team Flare Gun, and Enhanced Hammer, just to make sure their opponent couldn't even attack. And this is where Exeggutor would become a menace, since how do you normally deal with denial decks? Well, you rip through your deck and keep applying pressure and hope that they will eventually miss their denial cards, right? So you can snowball. Well, Blockade stops that strategy right there in its tracks, since you can no longer play supporters, so that means no Professor Sycamore or Ends to help you draw out of this nonsense. Like, when you actually sit down and think about it, how would you play a game where you have no energy in play and no access to your supporters? Think about how rough that could get. Dragalge would prevent poison Pokemon from retreating, so you actually had a defense to Keldeo Floatstone too. And just when you think Exeggutor's onslaught will stop because they have exhausted all their denial cards, they would play Lissandre's trump card to shuffle them all back in to continue the slaughter. And to top it all off, this Execute was in format. This had the Propagate ability, which would let you recover it from the discard pile as often as you liked in a turn. So that means you could basically use Ultra Ball dowsing machine, or computer search for free, as long as you had 2 in the discard pile. Madness. The deck even had a way to effectively play 2 supporters in a turn, by using Genesect EX's red signal to swap in an opponent's bench Pokemon into their active. This would basically let you play Lysandre plus any other supporter in a turn. A horrible deck that had no problems beating down anything in its way. Now I can't lie, I'm a big fan of Marshadow. It's a very cool and unique Pokemon, but this Marshadow card was responsible for single-handedly killing the format, resulting in many games being decided as early as turn 1. You see, this was back in the day where you could play a supporter on your first turn going first. This saw Lily become an absolute format staple. This would normally let you draw till you have 6 cards in your hand. However, if it was your first turn, you could draw till you have 8 instead. This would lead to explosive turn 1s where you would aim to get your Pokemon into play as soon as possible. However, what this little Marshadow would do is very upsetting. You see, Marshadow had the let loose ability that when benched would force both players to shuffle their hand into their deck and draw 4 cards. So it was basically judged on a coming into play ability. And for the most part, if you ever have a supporter on an ability, you kinda have to take it seriously. And that's what the player base did, because very fast people clocked on that if you were going first, you could play your Lily, get set up, and then at right the end of the turn, you could fire off a let loose Marshadow to not only extend your reach this turn, and to help set up for next turn, but essentially make your opponent start the game with a 4 card hand instead of 7. This meant your opponent immediately had much less options to start the game, and really reducing the chances of them having an explosive Lily like you did, making your opponent sometimes settle for suboptimal supporters like Cynthia for example, putting them immediately on the back foot. And it was this downright dirty Marshadow reducing hand size as early as turn 1 that decided so many games. It was so common and prevalent that the term "I got let loose" or Marshalled out the game became common talk of the format for people describing how they lost the game. Do you know how bad a card has to be for it to become a verb? Oh my goodness. And you know what? It happened to me too. Since all the way back then I was a Malamar player. Malamar relied on you getting 2 or 3 Malamar out as soon as possible to fuel your attackers like Giratina, Ultra Necrozma or Trevenant Dusknoir. With its ability Psychic Recharge, you could attach 1 Psychic Energy from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. The problem was, if you got let loose, it was very unlikely you would get a good amount of Inkay down early enough for you to realistically get into the game. A very, very scary card that looked very cute, don't get it twisted, but caused a ton of havoc on the Pokemon TCG. Now, Phantom Forces in my opinion should be in contention for being one of the best sets of all time, with some killer format staples like VS Seeker, which at the time every deck played because it let you put a supporter from your discard pile back into your hand ready for immediate use. Keep VS Seeker in mind, we will be revisiting it later. We also saw a ton of format essentials in this set like Zerosic, as well as the birth of some real strong archetypes like Mega Manetric EX with its Turbo Bolt and Night March. There was, however, one downright silly card in Phantom Forces that completely eliminated a whole win condition from the game, and while in the process of doing so created, in my opinion, the most hated deck in Pokemon history. Well, what was that card? Lysandre's Trump card. This card was meant to show Lysandre in the part of the X and Y games where he goes full crazy with his robotic arms and he sets his plan in motion to fire AZ's laser. Do some very naughty things. So how did Creature manage to harness the climax of the X and Y games into a card form then? Could be quite difficult, right? Well, to be fair, I think they did a pretty good job, all things considered, because this card is bonkers. Because what Lysandre's Trump card did was make both players shuffle their whole discard piles back into their deck. Yep, that is right. So completely eliminating the deck out strategy from the game, because if you ever got near the point of decking out, where you had little cards in your deck, you could just fire off all crazy Lysandre and you'd be straight back in the race. So how did this silly card result in the most hated deck in Pokemon history then? A deck so bad it actually forced TPCI to hop in and do something they haven't done in close to 15 years. Well, it didn't take the player base long to take Lysandre's Trump card and go wild. They quickly worked out if you could turbo through your deck in one turn, you could play a ton of high power disruption cards like Crushing Hammer to remove energy on a coin flip. Of course that coin flip wouldn't matter because, well, you'd be playing all 4 of them in one turn. You could use Team Flare Grunt to reliably remove energy, and find Head Ringers to make it even harder for your opponent to attack by increasing their attack costs you could pretty much fully lock your opponent down, right? And then once you've turboed through all those cards and your opponent can't do anything, you can just play Lissandre's trump card, often with a VS Seeker, so you could do it over and over and over again. So what kind of turbo cards allowed this strategy to work? Well, Aqua Bite let you look at the top 2 cards and take 1, Trainer's Meld let you take a trainer card from the top 4 cards of your deck, and Chain Mini X let you draw to have 6 cards in your hand. This deck even played a thick line of Swirlix of all things, which had the tasting ability, which let you draw 1 card once per turn, or 2 cards if it was in the active. And bear in mind this stack, so if you had 4 of these out, you could draw an extra 4 cards a turn. But the problem really wasn't all the turbo cards allowing you to draw your whole deck, because normally if you were to do that, you would just deck out pretty fast. The problem wasn't even the disruptive cards, because normally you couldn't spam them all in one turn. The real problem was the Lissandre's trump card effectively removing the balancing factor from both style of cards at the same time, making for a deadly combination that would immediately lock your opponent from doing anything, then spamming Kraken Punch from Seismitoad so you couldn't even play any item cards next turn, fully preventing any form of comeback. And it was this deck right here, Seismitoad Tasting, that forced TPCI to do something, and Lissandre's trump card got banned, saving the format. But at the time it was legal, the player base was absolutely distraught. I even refer to those times as the Dark Ages, because the Pokemon TCG was very, very dark. Yep, another trainer card that left the player base absolutely distraught, and TPCI was forced to step in once again. Pokemon Catcher. Yeah, actually, you heard me right, Pokemon Catcher. That card pretty much collects dust in everyone's bulk box, right? So how was it this low little uncommon ruled the format, making players rip their hair out? How does this happen? How did a card go from so hated to worthless pretty much almost instantly? Well, let me explain. You see, Pokemon Catcher used to read, swap one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active. Yep, that's right. So it was pretty much boss's orders on an item card. Can you now see why it was hated so much? The ability to swap your opponent's active is a very powerful effect in the Pokemon TCG. And to have it on a single item card is downright dirty. So if you really think about it, the ability to swap your opponent's active in the modern era has always been tied to supporters like Lissandre, Guzma and Boss's orders. If it has been on an item card, it's normally been restricted in some way. Think of Great Catcher only being able to gust stop GXs, or Custom Catcher forcing you to play 2 at the same time, or Counter Catcher forcing you to be behind on prizes, or Cross Switcher forcing you to play 2 again. But back in the day, Pokemon Catcher had it on an item, and bear in mind this existed at the same time as Skylar, which was pretty much a 4-off in every deck. Skylar let you search out your deck for any trainer card and put it in your hand. So that pretty much meant Skylar, at any point in the game, was a constant boss's order threat as well. Having this power on an item card let aggro decks focused around Landorus EX's Hammerhead attack, which did 30 to the active and 30 to the bench, or Mewtwo EX had the Export attack, which did 20 for each energy attached to both active Pokemon, literally rule the game and wreak havoc on any kind of evolution decks. This sort of big basic grinching got so bad TPCI had to step in again, and this time they errated Pokemon Catcher, saying that any iterations of the card that were played now had to require a coin flip to be successful. And all future cards were printed to reflect the new text of this card. A nice end to the story, but the next card that we're about to look at was literally so broken by a mistake by the game designers of all people, and they decided to actively do nothing about it for a good 2 years almost, potentially to sabotage their game on purpose. Slowking was released in the Neo Genesis expansion all the way back in December 2000, and to be honest, it was pretty lackluster. Its attack was pretty below average for the time, doing an absolutely maximum of 40 damage for 3 energy. Wow, times have changed, eh? Its Pokemon Power Mind Games was mildly interesting though. If it was in the active spot, it forced your opponent's trainers that they played to be subject to a coin flip to be successful. If that coin flip was heads, that trainer would do nothing and it would go to the top of their deck instead of their discard pile. This could have devastating consequences, all things considered, if you kept flipping heads on these mind game flips, since not only was pretty much every card worth playing a trainer back then, including Bill, let you draw 2, Professor Oak, discard your hand, draw 7, and Computer Search, which let you discard 2 cards from your hand and get any card from your deck. Because remember back then there was no supporters. Everything was under the straight trainer classification. So if it wasn't Pokemon or energy, it was a trainer. And Slowking would help disrupt all of them. But since those trainers would also go to the top of your deck instead of the discard pile, you knew you were guaranteed to not be able to progress your board state, because you knew that card you was about to top deck at the start of your next turn was going to be a trainer. And you also had a 50% chance of it doing nothing. This could sometimes grind your opponent to a halt, all things considered, if they were very unlucky. But 50% of the time their trainers would work, and you were forced to attack with a Slowking as well for mind games to work, because it had to be in the active, and its attack was, pretty dreadful. Except everything I just said, I just lied to you. Yep, you see, when Slowking was translated into English by Wizards of the Coast, they actually forgot to put the part in the ability that said if Slowking was in the active spot. Bit of a mistranslation. This meant you could do the absolutely unthinkable and have 4 Slowking on the bench with any attacker of your choice in the active, forcing your opponent to flip 4 tails in a row to play any trainer card. The format delved into just who could develop Slowking the fastest, since there was almost no downside to playing it, but the massive upside of completely stopping your opponent from doing anything. So then why wasn't an error like this fixed almost immediately though? Especially if the format became complete Slowking fests. Well, what I'm about to tell you is pure rumours and speculations, and has never been confirmed by any source. But the rumour was, since the Pokemon TCG was run and managed by Wizards of the Coast at the time, they saw what happened to the format and actively decided to wait almost 2 years before stepping in and doing anything, all in an effort to encourage people to play their game instead, Magic the Gathering. Who knows if that's actually true? I would really like to think it's not. Even if it was done on purpose or not, it didn't take long for Pokemon to step in and start to run the trading card game circuit themselves. And they've been doing a much better job, so happy days. What if I told you this little Shifty card from Next Destiny single-handedly had a whole format on lockdown and make the Pokemon TCG unplayable? Like, you would lose the game before you've even had a chance to take a turn. How? Well, you see, Shifty had the ability Giant Fan, which when you evolve it lets you flip a coin. If heads, you can pick one of your opponent's Pokemon and shuffle it back into their deck. If tails, nothing happens. This doesn't sound too great, right? I mean, sure, turn 2 with a rare candy, 50% of the time you might be able to shuffle in one of your opponent's Pokemon, but the other 50% of the time, you have jammed in a stage 2 into your deck for no reason. Like, what do you actually use to attack with in a Shifty deck? Well, here's the fun bit. Fun. You don't attack. In fact, you can never actually attack. You played no energies. But how would you win games then? We see in the expanded format, Forest of Giant Plants allowed your grass types to evolve on the first turn they were put into play. This meant if you had a grass type Seedot and Nuzleaf, you could actually rush a Shifty into play in a single turn. Doesn't stop there though, because what if I told you could warp this deck to be able to get upwards of 4 Shifty out in a single turn? I hear you asking right now, how can you get more than 4 Shiftys in a turn if you can only run 4? How is this possible? We see cards like Scoop Up Cyclone would let you pick up a whole Shifty line and put it all back into your hand. And as long as Forest of Giant Plants were still in play, you could put them all straight back down again. Super Scoop Up did the same thing as Scoop Up Cyclone, but on a coin flip. And Devolution Spray let you pick up the top stage and put it back into your hand, making you put it onto a different Nuzleaf. The rest of the deck was chock full of turbo cards, like Trainer's Mail, which let you look at the top 4 cards and take a trainer card from your deck. Bicycle, which lets you draw to your 4 cards in your hand. Acro Bike, which lets you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, take one and discard the other. And Recycle, which lets you on a coin flip, put any card from your discard pile back to the top of your deck. This turned the Shifty deck into a machine, capable on your first turn of removing all your opponent's Pokemon from play, before they've even had a chance to have a turn yet. Crazy stuff. Like, when you actually sit down and think about it here for a second, how many times, if you're going second, have you had your opening hand and had at least 3 basic Pokemon in? Because if you didn't, a Shifty deck could shuffle them all away before you've even had a chance to have a turn, meaning you would lose instantly. This even led to this little Boltoy card seeing play because of its barrier ancient trait ability, making it immune to effective abilities from your opponent's Pokemon. This means Giant Fang couldn't touch it, and since it was a basic, you could lead it, and a Shifty deck couldn't do anything about it, meaning Shifty players would auto-concede if they ever saw this Boltoy. Luckily, when Faster Giant Plants got banned and expanded, Shifty became unplayable, saving the format and the Pokemon TCG with it. Happy days. While this card is gorgeous, and make no mistake about it, it looks incredible in binders, it was a terror for the player base when it was legal. You see, it was a stadium card that actually had different effects depending on which way it was facing. If the red side was facing you, your grass, fire and water Pokemon would do 20 less damage. Not too bad. It was the blue side that was the killer though. If the blue side was facing you, you could only have 3 bench Pokemon. This could be a massive hindrance for your opponent or a game-saving play for yourself. Let me explain. So if your opponent's board was chock full of random support Pokemon like Hooper, Shaman and Shaman, you could Parallel City lock them, making it unable for them to bench any more attackers. Really devastating and making it hard for them to get into the game. This could literally end games before they've even started, to be perfectly honest. However, the main way this stadium was used is when you had a setup that was really good, let's say 2 Mega Mewtwo EXs and a basic Mew V on the bench and 2 Shaman, you could Parallel City yourself, forcing yourself down to 3 bench Pokemon. But here's the good bit. You would just discard the Shaman, removing all the easy prizes for your opponent, making it much harder for them to win the game. Both scenarios were absolutely backbreaking for your opponent and could sometimes make it an instant game winner if it hit the field at the right time. Not bad for a stadium card, all things considered. Mawile GX took an already super strong archetype and made it borderline unfair to play against, making it so if you went second, you could actually pretty much lose the game there and then before you've even had a chance to play a card. Yep, really. You see, on face value, Mawile GX seems really underwhelming. 170 HP? Rubbish. Its attacks weren't much better either. Wily Bite did 10 plus 30 for each bench Pokemon your opponent had in play. This maxes at 160 if your opponent had a full bench. Trash. And while Big Eater GX seems like it could steal some games, discarding all your supporters from your opponent's hand, this wasn't the main reason why Mawile was hated so much. People hated Mawile due to its ability Captivating Wink. This would activate when you bench Mawile, and it would let you look at your opponent's hand and bench any Pokemon you find there. At the time, the format was ran by Pokemon like Dedenne, which would let you discard your hand and draw 6 cards, Crobat V, which would let you draw up to 6 when you bench it, and Eldegoss V, which would let you grab a supporter from the discard pile when you bench it. What do all 3 of these format defining cards that pretty much every deck played have in common? There were 2 things I need you to look out for. Have a go. Oh wait. That's right, the first thing is that they all have abilities that work when you put them into play. Mawile forces them onto your bench when it's not your turn, meaning those abilities do nothing. Absolutely backbreaking, meaning you now have these low HP 2-prize Pokemon on the bench taking up bench space, easy prizes, and you didn't even get to use them. Especially if the Mawile player did this on their first turn going first. This could potentially remove all your draw options from your hand, leaving you with nothing to do. But what is the next thing all those Pokemon have in common though? Yep, that's right. If you said they all have under 180 HP, you are 100% correct. Well done you. Why is this number so relevant though? You see, Mawile was played exclusively in the Arceus, Dialga, Palkia deck. This deck would aim to use Ultra Creation as fast as possible, making your Pokemon do an extra 30 damage for the rest of the game and take an extra prize card when you KO something. So imagine if you pulled off this GX attack and then forced your opponent to bench these low HP Pokemon that can be gobbled up very easily, and give up an extra prize card in doing so. Meaning these all gave up 3 prize cards in total. What made it even more insulting though is after you used Ultra Creation, Arceus, Dialga, Palkia's attack Ultimate Ray would now do 180 damage. Meaning you could one-shot these bench hitters for 3 prize cards and also accelerate 3 energy from your deck to your Pokemon any way you like. And this pretty much wrapped up any game you were playing as an ADP player if you had an Ultimate Ray onto a fresh attacker. Some sneaky ADP players even ran 2 more Wiles, like me, to try and fire off this game-ending ability twice, just in case the first one missed. Gross scenes. Hypnotoxic Laser was so strong, it certainly means we will never see an item card that can inflict multiple special conditions ever again. Hypnotoxic Laser was an item card that poisoned your opponent's active and then you flipped a coin. If heads, they were also asleep too. This means 25% of the time you played a Hypnotoxic Laser, your opponent's active would stay asleep, forcing them to find a switch, otherwise they couldn't attack, and then they lost a ton of pressure and their chances at winning their game. However, the main use of laser was really as a maths fixer. So you could basically look at laser as a plus power in pretty much all scenarios, meaning you would do an extra 10 damage. But what if I told you this card was better than a plus power because you actually had a way of boosting the damage by 30? How was that then? Well, you see, laser existed at the same time as Verbank City Gym, which made poison Pokemon take an extra 2 damage in between turns. This means you now have a plus 30 damage at any time with a combination of 2 trainer cards from your hand. Imagine if that was in format now. Arceus would just need a laser and a Verbank to do 200 damage turn 2 with Trinity Nova, or you could even swing up to 240 if you have a Choice Band or Vitality Band attached, meaning you could now KO Arceus V and Lugia's 2 turn 2 with a DTE attached. Game changing. Mew VMAX would essentially have another 4 power tablets. Think about how crazy that is already. Or Dialga V-Star of all things could play this combo to make Star Chronos hit 280 damage if you have a Choice Belt attached, allowing you to KO V-Star Pokemon and then immediately take a next turn. Honestly, Laserbank combo was way too good, and I am glad to see it go. I have saved the best till last though, because I cannot stand Battle VIP Pass and how bad it is for the Pokemon TCG. On face value, what's not to like about it? It helps players set up right, letting you grab 2 basic Pokemon and put them straight into play. This can help multi-prize decks like Rapid Strike Urshifu and Mew VMAX, and also help single prize decks like Lost Box and Chien-Pao too. So surely a card that helps pretty much all decks can't be bad, can it? I mean, look, even look at the top 8 decks from the last World Championships, they all play Battle VIP Pack. Well, yes, you could be right. Except there's another little bit of text on Battle VIP Pass that says you can only play this card on your first turn of the game. And it's that text right there that makes Battle VIP Pass awful. Let me explain. Battle VIP Pass is the absolute king of making Pokemon TCG games very polarized. What do I mean by this? Well, imagine a game where you hit a Battle VIP Pass, or maybe even multiple, and your opponent doesn't. This, more times than not, puts you at a massive advantage, meaning the game will quickly snowball out of hand and making it unwinnable for your opponent. This difference is even greatly magnified if you went first too, making it to where if you go second and miss Battle VIP Pass, the game can often end right there and then. It doesn't stop there though, because not only are you at a massive disadvantage, missing the Battle VIP Passes, but now your deck is objectively worse, making a comeback an even more monumental task and a pretty much impossible one. How is that? Because now you have 4 fully dead useless cards in your deck, watering down its effectiveness and clogging up your hand. But the absolute worst part about Battle VIP Pass though is that because its effect is so godly and so strong, you have no choice but to play it. Because if you swap them all out for, let's say, Nest Balls, while your opponent still had Battle VIP Pass, it wouldn't be a contest. You would still get blown out of the water. So honestly, I can't wait for Battle VIP Pass to rotate, because it's actually making the Pokemon TCG much worse to play.